Greetings, it's Matt from Hidden Machine here, and the shoot 'em up, or shmup, is one of the oldest types of video games. From 1962's Space War to the upcoming Signai, All Guns Blazing, the genre has gone through a lot of changes over the years, but the core principles remain the same. You fly around and shoot at stuff. Landmark titles like 1978's Space Invaders and 1985's Gradius acted almost like templates for other contemporary shmups to follow, and for a time, it was a dominant video game genre. So many classic arcade shoot-em-ups from the 80s and 90s became widely regarded standout cartridges for 8 and 16-bit home consoles, but over the past 2 decades or so, the genre has largely narrowed down to focus on a niche audience. This happened for a bunch of reasons, but in my opinion, it has a lot to do with the shift from arcade gaming to a focus on gaming at home. Some arcades are still around, but back in the 80s and 90s, they were ubiquitous. It took a long time for home consoles and even PC gaming to catch up to the powerful speed and graphics that you could find on display at your local arcade. When it came to shoot-em-ups, many arcade cabinets utilized a vertical display at a time when most televisions were still using a 4:3 aspect ratio. While a vertical or tate mode has been added to many shooters since the proliferation of 16:9 TVs and monitors, it's something that's utilized mostly by shoot-em-up enthusiasts rather than casual players. As 3D graphics became more popular in the early 90s, shoot-em-up games responded by becoming more intense. More and more objects, enemies, and projectiles would appear on screen, planting the seeds for what would eventually become the bullet hell subgenre. Despite this, fighting games were becoming the most popular genre in the arcades, and shoot-em-ups really began to wane in popularity. 1998's Radiant Silvergun reinvigorated the genre to a degree, and included bosses that were homages to some shoot-em-up games that came before it. But it wouldn't be long after the release of this game that we'd begin to see a steady decline in the number of active malls and arcades across the country. This, combined with home consoles finally being able to achieve arcade-quality graphics, would completely overturn the arcade's place in gaming. Games for home consoles became longer and more in-depth than their arcade counterparts ever could, and genres like the first-person shooter, the Western RPG, and third-person 3D action games would become much more popular than fighters or shoot-em-ups. Throughout all of this, the shmup genre lost its mass appeal, but it did continue to grow and innovate in order to cater to a niche audience seeking intense, demanding, hardcore games. Many modern shoot-em-ups are extremely difficult for newcomers to the genre, and some utilize unique and often complex systems that require the player to do a whole lot more than just shoot and dodge. While I do enjoy some of these more hardcore modern shooters, for me the sweet spot is more in the early to mid-90s, where the games could still be very difficult, but there isn't a mind-bending number of bullets flying around on the screen. Andro Dunos is a Neo Geo game that saw both home and arcade releases in 1992. The game lets players scroll through a selection of 4 weapons as they fly around and shoot at stuff. It has nice visuals and sound, but overall it's not really a remarkable game, and there are certainly better shoot-em-ups from that time. That's why I was very surprised to see that the game recently received a sequel, the aptly named Andro Dunos II. Developed by Picarinsoft, another company whose name that I'm not entirely sure I'm pronouncing correctly, Andro Dunos II looks and feels exactly like it was just pulled out of a time capsule buried in the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, game reviews were often a paragraph or so at most, aside from games that were able to secure multiple-page spreads, but even those articles were full of background information and screenshots. The language of games was more succinct at that time. You had well-established genres, and games either succeeded at achieving or innovating in those genres, and you could say in fewer words whether or not a game was any good. Because of this, and because of how faithful Andro Dunos II is to the era that it's inspired by, I opted to talk for a while about the history of shoot-em-ups, because otherwise this video probably would have been very short. But I also brought up all of that other stuff to give context, because I was so excited to find a modern shoot 'em up that wasn't in the bullet hell genre, but rather one that dipped back into the genre's past, took the best elements from it, and refined them into a top-notch example of what made so many people love those games in the first place. It's hard to really articulate what makes a good shoot 'em up. It's a very carefully balanced mix of speed, enemy placement, firepower, level design, artwork, and sound. Andro Dunos II knocks it out of the park on all these fronts. It uses the first game as a jumping-off point, but excels so much further. It opens up with energizing music and a cool little cutscene, and then you're off. You have 4 weapons to choose from, and you can scroll through these and select them at any time using the shoulder buttons. Each of them can be upgraded by collecting these little S power-ups. Each weapon has a main rapid-fire attack, as well as a secondary powered-up attack, which has a brief cooldown period after you use it. Your ship also launches missiles as you fire your main weapon, and these can be upgraded as well, along with your shields. Every time you switch your weapon type, your missiles, shield formation, and attack pattern also switches. Whereas in many shoot 'em ups I would just find my favorite weapon and then upgrade that, this game pushes players to upgrade and use all of the weapon types. Different stages will feature different obstacles, enemies, and bosses that will be best handled by a specific weapon. For instance, this boss often loops around behind me, so I'm using a weapon that shoots in 2 directions. It's not quite as brutal as something like Doom Eternal that requires players to be constantly switching weapons, but rather it's just a way to ensure that your entire arsenal is valuable and forces you to assign your upgrade points accordingly. Throughout stages, you pick up these little blue orbs, and you can get up to 30 in a level. Every 10 that you trade in at the end of a stage nets you 1 more upgrade point, which you can assign where you please, or trade it in to add more points to your score. You'll lose an upgrade point every time you die, but you can usually get them back pretty easily if you stay sharp. Aside from co-op play, which would have been a fun addition, this game features all of the standard options that you would expect. You can set your difficulty, the number of credits you start with, and change your button layout. There's also a level select, but it's difficult to play the later levels without having played the earlier ones first so that you can upgrade your ship. The music for the game was composed by Alistair Brimble, who has worked on a ton of games going all the way back to the days of the Amiga. His soundtrack for this game is great. I know I've said it already, but the game is just good. The level design is engaging and well-paced, enemies feature unique behaviors and interesting designs, and the whole thing just feels right. If I didn't know better, I'd be sure that this was some long-lost gem from the arcade era. The game doesn't just feel retro for the sake of retro, it takes retro influences and really makes them into a superb shoot 'em up. The game starts out relatively easy, and has a very gradual ramp in difficulty that I think should encourage players who are new to the genre. Hidden Machine received a review copy of the game, but I wouldn't hesitate to pay full price for it. Andro Dunos II is available now on PC, and it's also being released on the Switch, 3DS, PS4, Xbox One, and the Dreamcast. Have you played Andro Dunos II? Do you have a favorite shoot 'em up? Personally, I love Ikaruga and the Raiden Fighters series, but I also never turn down a chance to play 1942 or 1943 if I see them out in the wild anywhere. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to Hidden Machine for new videos all week long. See ya!